If you asked me a few years ago how I prune my eggplant, I would absolutely have given you a confused look and a pretty major eye roll. I mean, who prunes their eggplant? Is that really even necessary? Has this pruning thing gone too far? As it turns out, we should probably all be pruning our eggplants because there is actually a surprising amount of real university-backed research behind doing so. And I love little tips or tricks or hacks or whatever you want to call it, little things we can do in the garden that are actually going to produce meaningfully better results and help us grow more food. So I'm super excited to get into pruning this eggplant and hopefully show you how you can do the same at home. Let's get into it. This beautiful little plant right here is growing in our backyard container garden, and it just started to flower, and that is the perfect age to start your pruning. So this plant is going to serve as our demo for today. Now there are a few different types of pruning, and they're all important, so we're going to talk about all of them today, but we're going to start with the most important, and that is pruning for yield or output by controlling the total number of leaders or stems on the plant. Me personally, I shoot for 4 total leaders or stems or vines on the plant. And that's just because that seems to be the ideal number based on the university-backed research that I'm able to find, but it's probably a bit of a wash between 3 or 4, so you can kind of choose your poison. But the point is, we're going to go ahead and limit this plant to either 3 or 4 of these main fruiting branches during its entire life cycle. We're gonna get into the how of doing that in 1 second, but real quick, the why of it is that pruning this eggplant is going to help it produce not only more fruit, but better fruit. And just to reiterate that real quick, because I really do think it bears repeating, pruning this plant is going to result in not only more eggplants, those eggplants are going to be bigger, they are going to taste better, and they're going to have demonstrably higher nutrient content. I mean, that is cool, right? In every way, this plant's output is going to be improved when we give it an aggressive pruning strategy. Now with a tomato like this one right here, we would achieve a multi-leader system by leaving the primary stem in place, obviously, and then letting the desired number of suckers grow out as well. Typically that's either no suckers or 1 sucker. A lot of gardeners are pretty familiar with that strategy. Maybe you've done it yourself already. But the overall structure of an eggplant is a little bit different. With an eggplant, we can use these suckers to create main leaders, but we can also rely on the natural branching habit of an eggplant, right? Each of these main stems is eventually going to form a nice little Y branch, kind of like a tomatillo or a more determinate style plant. Or we can even use a mix of that natural branching habit of the stem and suckers. Let's take a closer look. This right here is a sucker. You can see that it is popping out directly in the leaf node between a leaf and the main branch, and it pops out with its own little set of sort of narrow leaves from the get-go. Now you can see this young eggplant is already absolutely loaded with suckers. We have way more than my desired 4 total stems at this point, which means that I need to go through here and remove all of the extra ones that I don't want. Now I'm gonna get to this in a second. I've already identified 2 that I'm going to leave on, and I'll talk about why, but that still leaves us with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so that I need to pop off. So let's take a closer look at exactly how to do that. A sharp knife works pretty good for this, but honestly, you can really just use your fingers. All I typically do is get in there, kind of push it to one side, push it back to the other side, and then it snaps off nice and easy. So let's go ahead and do it. Feels good to get those off there. I think the plant looks a little bit nicer now. As I mentioned, I did leave a couple of the suckers on there intentionally, specifically these 2 right here. And the reason is I personally like to just create sort of this tree-like canopy. So basically the idea is I'm gonna leave these 2 branches to come up in this direction, right? They're gonna come up like this. And then I'm gonna leave these 2 suckers on here, and it was just by luck that I chose these 2 because they're in a really nice position, and they're both gonna grow out like this. And what that's gonna do is basically create a nice circular canopy coming up here and then leading all the way down to the stem, basically like an upside down cone. And that just makes it a little bit easier to see the flowers, make sure that they're getting nice and pollinated, make sure that there's no bugs preying on the plant. And overall, I just think it looks a little bit nicer. So definitely an element of personal preference in there as well. Right now, now this plant just has sort of the two main branches and then these two suckers on here, but eventually these suckers are going to produce suckers and these branches are going to split off and create new branches. And unfortunately, we only really want those 4 total leaders, which means that every time this sucker produces a new sucker, I'm gonna go ahead and remove that new sucker. And every time one of these branches goes ahead and branches off and creates a new Y, I'm just going to snip off or top the less dominant ones. Whichever looks like the main branch, I'm just gonna leave that and remove all the new ones. And the idea is we are just sticking with 4 total leaders on this plant in perpetuity. If you're also looking super closely, you may notice that I did leave on a couple teeny tiny suckers here on these main branches. And the reason is I have just developed sort of this paranoia around removing teeny tiny suckers because it's really easy to think you're getting in there and removing a sucker when what you're actually doing is topping the branch, which is not what we want to do. These are the biggest, most productive, most important branches on the plant right now. So what I normally do is I just let the main branch that I'm intentionally growing out get a little bit bigger and put on a flower just so I can be 100% sure that that is actually the branch I want to keep and not a sucker. It's really easy to get in here and be like, I'm just going so fast. Let me just remove this sucker. Let me remove this sucker, and accidentally push your plant's timeline back by a number of weeks by accidentally topping one of those main branches. Real quick, if you do think this video has helped you understand how to prune your eggplants for maximum yield and health, I would so appreciate it if you could give it a quick like. Just really helps us out. Thank you so very much. Let's get back to the eggplant pruning. If you are anything like me at this point in the game, you're saying, hey, that's all well and good, but where on earth did this advice for 3 to 4 liters come from? That seems like a pretty random, arbitrary number, considering this plant will eventually create many more branches than that left to its own devices. Well, the reality is the plant just has different goals in mind than we do. And I will say that this is what I actually do in my garden, and it works really well. It's also pretty common, or at least it seems to be pretty common based on my conversations with other gardeners with experience growing eggplants. But much more important than that anecdotal experience is it is also backed up by very high quality university-backed experimental research. I will link to 3, maybe 4 experiment overviews in the description that will show you exactly what I mean. They found that pruning like this does produce better results. But the best one is from the University of New Hampshire's Extension Office, and they looked just very specifically at what is the impact of pruning for a specific number of liters on an eggplant's overall yield and the quality and size of those fruits. And you can see right here in their conclusion table or their results table that the plants that were spaced at 12 inches apart and pruned to 4 total liters produced not only more fruits, they produced bigger fruits and they produced higher quality or more marketable fruits. And more marketable just means that they are able to be sold. They are higher quality fruits. And what's important to note about this data is that it is not on a per plant basis. It is on a per foot basis, which means that the plants that were pruned to 4 total liters and spaced out at 12 inches outperformed in terms of the total number of eggplants produced in that whole row, even the plants that were planted at 6 inches and pruned more aggressively, meaning that the best results were from 12-inch spacing with 4 total liters. Very cool, and I will definitely link to this research in the description if you want to look a little bit closer. And that really brings me to the last note I want to make about this strategy. To get the most out of this really aggressive pruning style that I'm advocating for in this video, you really need to be spacing your plants quite densely, so ideally at about 12 inches. If you've seen any of my videos on pruning tomatoes, you may recall that I generally advocate for removing these first sets of flowers, and that's just to allow the plant to sort of focus on putting on root growth and generating more foliage. Generally speaking, the plant is going to try and put out fruit a little bit earlier than we really want it to, and that initial fruit set is very expensive in terms of energy and nutrition relative to the size of the plant. It's just still not that big. In general, with eggplants, same story. If you haven't transplanted out your plant yet, it's still in a temporary container and it's already flowering, definitely a good idea to go ahead and remove those flowers before you transplant it out. At that point, you definitely want it focusing on creating a healthy root system. Similarly, if you just transplanted it out and it's still getting established and it's still relatively small, I would go ahead and say remove that first 1 to 2 sets of flowers. So am I going to remove these? No, because there's kind of one exception to that rule, and that is with plants that were planted out later in the season and are on a bit of a time crunch, which is very much the case right here. We're in early September, and this plant is kind of racing against the sun to produce fruit. And I don't want to do anything at all that is going to delay that initial harvest. This plant will not put out that many eggplant for the year, unfortunately, just simply because we got a really late start on this. It's in our container garden. We do things a little bit differently. We've actually already removed all of the eggplants in our main front garden. They lived out their life and produced lots of fruits. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave these on, but typically at this size, I would be snipping them off. So you know what? I feel kind of bad for lower leaves these days. They're really getting a bad rap. People just kind of remove them willy-nilly. Like, does this lower leaf look like an unproductive, useless appendage on this plant? It's definitely not. This is a productive, important solar panel that is producing energy for this plant. And this plant is still quite small and it needs all of the energy it can get. I'm definitely going to leave this lower leaf on, even though it's only, I don't know, 4 to 6 inches off the ground. Now, there are some cases where it does make sense to remove the lower leaves, so let's talk about those real quick. I would say, first off, if it is actually low enough that it is hitting the ground or hitting the potting soil, and you know that you struggle with soil-borne diseases, well, that's probably a good reason to go ahead and remove that leaf. We don't actually seem to deal with a whole lot of soil-borne eggplant diseases, but I do deal with a lot of eggplant pests. And I know that the lower leaves on this plant are going to get absolutely munched on. And a quick tip here is you should always sort of remove a little bit of the mulch around the base and just make sure that you're actually looking quite closely. Some of those leaves will pop up at the very, 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 very bottom. So first off, I'm gonna go ahead and pop those right off. Now, another good reason is if you are noticing that some of your leaves, and I don't know if you can see this one right here, are getting a little bit mangled and beaten up. This one is kind of torn up, partly just by me moving around the container too many times, trying to find a good spot for it, and partially from white flies and beetles. And so this leaf right here looks to me like it is kind of in danger of becoming an infection carrier, right? It is in danger of getting infected and spreading that to the rest of the plant. It is really, really beaten up. So I am going to go ahead and remove this one right now. Snip. And I would go ahead and say that this one probably, unfortunately, falls into that same category. These lower 2 leaves, they just got really, really beat up by pests, unfortunately, and they're looking like they may have some problems, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove them. These ones right up above, though, that are still only, actually this one's probably only 3 to 4 inches off the ground, I'm leaving this on. This is a productive element of this plant. I do not want to remove it. Finally, it is a good idea to start removing those lower leaves as they, over time, start to become unproductive. And you can tell that they're becoming unproductive when they start to wilt and become a little crispy and crack and go yellow. None of these leaves are anywhere near that, but in, I don't know, a month or so, they're really gonna be old enough and they're not gonna be receiving enough sunlight anyways, because that canopy we're creating is gonna shade them out, that they're basically just going to be net takers of energy on the plant. And at that point, I'm gonna go ahead and remove them. But again, when that plant is small and I'm letting it fruit like this, I need these big leaves on here to help it collect that energy. So you're probably ready at this point to go off and prune your own eggplants, and I totally understand that. But I did want to share kind of one optional, maybe a more advanced twist on the sucker pruning guidance that we shared earlier. And this is actually the strategy that University of New Hampshire study that we looked at together followed. And basically what you do with this twist is, rather than taking the sucker off at the base right here where it meets that node between the main stem and the leaf, you're gonna let it grow out to the point where it starts flowering, let it set a single fruit, and then top it right above that fruit. And basically what you're doing is allowing each sucker to still put on a fruit, but not pull tons and tons of energy from the plant by growing completely out of control. I don't really have enough strong evidence where I can say, hey, this is a better option, but I kind of suspect it is. And it's something I would do if I had more time to keep track of sort of each plant's individual pruning status. It's not realistic for me in my garden with the number of plants that we have to prune, but maybe it's something that you are interested in. So if you want to go that extra mile, just let those suckers grow out until they put on that first fruit and then top them right above it. And then before we wrap up here, I'm just gonna go ahead and stake the plant real quick. All I'm gonna use is a single bamboo stick. I do typically use a larger stake. I actually like to use a furring strip, just cut down to about 18 inches for my eggplants. But I have done a few little pokes into the soil, and this plant actually has a pretty robust root system. And so I'm gonna go ahead and use a thinner bamboo stake in order to sort of create the minimal amount of damage on those roots as I can. A larger furring strip would really just punch a big hole into those, and I kind of want to just avoid that. So we're gonna stick it in here just 1.5 to 2 inches away from the base of the plant, all the way down to the bottom. And then I am going to go ahead and kind of tie it in here. I just use a natural fiber twine for this, mainly because it's cheap and I have a ton of it. And yeah, I'm just gonna pull it in there nice and tight, but not too tight. I do want to leave room for that stem to grow and expand. And if you are wondering whether it's problematic that the plant is now kind of leaning over like this, it totally isn't. It will pop right back up into place in no time at all. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining me as I pruned up this eggplant. I've got a couple more to do, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I really hope you learned something useful today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope I see you on the next one. Until next time, y'all, happy gardening.